Hi, storyteller. What's your rule of thumb for keeping readers interested in your story? Like, what measuring stick do you use to check if readers will turn pages? Very often, writers are told to make sure that the reader is asking what happens next, and they'll keep engaged. I certainly have been given this advice, but my personal take on it is... No. Admittedly, it's a pet peeve of mine when I hear that advice, but I do understand it comes from a good place and is well meant. However, its big pitfall is that readers don't technically ever ask what happens next, even if they're super engaged by a story. What our brains do instead is anticipate or predict what we think will happen next based on what we know about the world in general and about the story world in particular, and then we read on to see how accurate our prediction is. The information gap isn't empty. We come up with a hypothesis, and what drives us on is finding out if our hypothesis is right or wrong. And you might be thinking, this is peak pedantic even for me, but I get hung up on it because it does matter for how you write and if your readers will indeed turn the pages or be bored out of their minds. While this of course isn't the only engagement technique to get readers hooked, it is a pretty big one, and it underlies so many others. So how do you make sure your story keeps your readers' interest? Well, the short answer is balance the reader's uncertainty with enough information so that they can make effective predictions. The longer answer is the rest of this video, where I will cover how our prediction engine works, the 5 most important points to keep readers turning pages, and the 3 most common pitfalls to avoid. Let's dig in. How does our prediction engine work? Let's do a quick demonstration so you can better follow what I'm talking about. Tell me honestly how hooked you are by these sentences. Samantha walked down the street. The grass was green, the sky was blue, the air was crisp. Chances are that you're feeling uninterested at best. These aren't terrifically bad sentences, but they're just not terribly interesting either. In theory, you could be wondering what's at the end of the street, where is she going, what happens next, but you're not. Now, let's take the second example. Samantha walked down the street. The grass was green, the sky was blue, she heard rustling in a bush. We still don't have the most gripping prose here, but now you're a bit more interested than before. What do you think is in the bush? I did this little demo on my podcast, and yes, by the way, I do host a podcast with my friend and fellow book coach Inna. It's called The Writer's Toolbox. You should check it out. I will leave a link in the comment. Anyway, I asked Inna what was in the bush, and she said a bird, because where she lives, there's all these little birds rustling in the bushes. I thought there was a bunny, because where I live, well, we have a lot of bunnies. And you might be thinking something entirely different altogether. The point is that though you might not have consciously noticed it, your brain began filling in options of what might be in that bush. This filling in of options is curiosity. And this is what I mean when I say you're technically not asking what happens next, but you are predicting it. The reason this matters is because if your brain does not predict, either because it's too obvious what it is, so you believe you already know the answer, or because it's too vague so you can't begin to even guess what it is, you will not be curious, and you will be less engaged, and less likely to read on. The bottom line is that as a writer, you need to be aware that readers aren't passive vessels who are idly wondering what happens next. They are active participants who have thoughts on what will happen. Given this, let's look at the 5 most important points to keep in mind to make the best use of this feature. How to keep readers turning pages. Point 1. The role of uncertainty. Let's think back to our example of Samantha walking down the street. The reason you didn't care the slightest about the first set of sentences was because there was no uncertainty. Your brain easily supplied a woman walking down the street, green grass, blue sky, crisp air. It completely matched your model of the world, and everything was as expected. Because there was no uncertainty to resolve, your brain didn't bother to make you feel curious. In the second example, though, there was a small uncertainty, and it lit a faint flicker of curiosity. But uncertainty can go too far. Some writers are really tempted to keep the reader in the dark about many aspects of their characters. I see this often with beginner writers, but some intermediate writers do it too. They present you with this often very cool-looking character who is aloof and has a deep dark secret that she doesn't want anyone to know. Any attempts from other characters to learn more about her go nowhere. The writer often thinks that this will fire up the reader's curiosity, but instead it completely backfires. Having no uncertainty is boring, but having everything be completely uncertain is equally boring. The key here is that to engage the reader with this technique, give us a little bit of uncertainty, which brings me to the next point. Point number 2, the role of information. So how do you hit that sweet spot that will give readers just enough uncertainty to get them curious, but not too much to get them to bounce off? The number one thing I tell writers is to make sure that the reader understands the character's goals and stakes of those goals. What is the character trying to achieve, and what do they stand to lose or gain if they achieve it? If your reader understands this information, then their powers of prediction can go a long way. Samantha walking down the street isn't goal-oriented behavior, but if we know that she's running to the corner store because she ran out of sugar, that she needs to finish baking her cake in time to host her friends, including a really cute new friend that she's trying to impress, well, now our prediction engines are firing up. We really want her to finish that cake in time, and we read on to see if she does. And now, when we hear the rustling in the bush and she slows her step, we have a much clearer understanding of what's at stake if she dawdles. Understanding things feels good. Giving your reader enough information so that they can make predictions about the future developments of your story is fundamentally engaging. So make sure your character's goals and stakes are clear. Point number 3, scene level versus global level curiosity. How long can you sustain reader curiosity with this technique? Well, ideally until the end of your book, or if you're writing a series, until the end of your series. But the key is that you're not going to pull this off with a single information gap. I find the most successful stories have at least 3 info gaps operating at the same time. 1 short term, 1 medium term, and 1 long term. As you saw with the Samantha example, we can generate scene-level curiosity, even paragraph-level curiosity. The question of what's rustling in the bush could be resolved in 2 sentences, and then that prediction is satisfied and the info gap is closed. So I'd call that a short term. A medium-term info gap would be resolving whether or not Samantha manages to impress that cute new friend with her baking skills, and if anything romantic comes of that. Depending on your pacing, that could be 1 or more chapters. And long-term info gaps don't have to last the whole book, but in some books they can. Most murder mysteries fall into this category where from the beginning of the story, you're making predictions as to who the killer is. One big tip to make the long-term info gap successful is to not let the reader settle on a single answer for too long. With short and medium-term gaps, you can let the reader predict the right answer, and it still feels satisfying to us if we're right. Like, if I'm rooting for Samantha to bake an amazing cake and she does, and the friend is impressed, I'll feel good. But if in a murder mystery I predict from chapter 2 that the butler did it, and at no point do I waver from that and it turns out I was right, that feels really unsatisfying and predictable. It veers back to the territory of knowing too much and being bored by it. The best long-term info gaps provide information in intervals that make us question our predictions. Okay, but you might be thinking, what happens to the short and medium-term gaps when they are closed? So let's look at our next point. Point number 4, payoff and setup. When you give your reader an answer to an information gap that you have created, think of it as a payoff. Samantha hears the rustling in the bushes, she goes to check what it is, and it is indeed a bunny. If I were to give the reader this payoff, the good news is that they'd experience a little bit of satisfaction. The bad news is that their information gap is now closed, and so their curiosity to read on diminishes. You might experience this in even really good books that when a chapter or a whole section finally gives you a payoff, you feel satisfied but might not want to read on. Writers here often rely on the long-term information gap to keep readers reading. And if your audience is a great match for your book, they might, but it still will cost you some momentum. So if you are delivering a payoff, I suggest you quickly set up the next information gap. In the Samantha example, it would look like this. She checks the bush and it's a bunny, but the bunny is injured. Now, a new information gap opens up and the reader begins predicting options for what Samantha should do with an injured bunny. This is a new setup. If you're anything like me, you would hope that she'll get it help, and so you'll read on to check if she does. Stories that create new information gap setups immediately after payoffs feel like they have faster pacing and give you this page-turner feeling. Stories that wait a bit longer between payoff and setup, or even don't primarily rely on that technique at all, they have slower pacing. Point number 5. Strategically play with your reader's predictions. Now, when you're giving your reader the payoff, should it be this thing that they're most likely predicting it will be, or should you try to make them wrong? This may sound counterintuitive, but most of the time you should actually give your readers what they already think will happen, but then add something that they most likely did not predict in order to open the next information gap. Like in the Samantha example, there's a rustling in the bush, so your brain goes to small animal. It's a bunny, so the prediction was correct, but the bunny is injured. That's something most people would not be predicting just off the rustling cue alone. So think of it as a yes-but framing. You're telling your reader, yes, it's what you were thinking, but there's more. On rare occasions, though, you can create some really cool effects by subverting your reader's expectations. Back to Samantha checking out the rustling. Your reader is predicting that it'll be a small animal, but instead it's a tentacle shooting out of the ground, and Samantha screams. Now you're cueing your reader into the world of your story and telling them this is not a strict realism story. Instead of the tentacle, let's say it's a two-headed bunny, but Samantha does not bat an eye at it. This is establishing both your world and the fact that weird things are common in the world. So giving your reader something unexpected as a payoff is a great world-building tool. It's also a strong character-building tool. You and I would of course help an injured bunny, but what about Samantha? If she just walks away, your reader instantly has a clear sense of a big part of her character. Or even worse, let's say that she takes the injured bunny and puts it in the middle of the road, petting it and telling it that it will be out of its misery soon, and then she walks away to get the sugar for the cake. Sheesh, this might not be your cup of tea, but it certainly builds a character. But as said, most of the time you want to give your reader what they actually are expecting to get and just add a little extra to open a new information gap. And why this is will become clear in the first pitfall that I will discuss. 3 most common pitfalls to avoid. Now, if you don't understand the underlying psychology of curiosity, it's very easy for writers to try to surprise and engage your readers in ways that actually disengage them. I'm currently editing a manuscript by a published author and noticing a couple pitfalls. I have her full permission to talk about them so that you too can spot and fix them in your own work. And I'd like to emphasize that this is a first draft. So for those of you who may be less experienced, know that it's very normal, even for very seasoned writers, to run into some of these pitfalls in very early drafts. Writing a novel is quite complicated after all. Number 1. Upending reader expectations about human nature. As discussed previously, you can upend your reader's expectations to create effective character building and world building moments. However, this only works if at the core the character's behavior matches our mental model of human behavior. The manuscript that I'm currently editing is set in contemporary North America with all the customs and expectations that you would have in modern-day life. The main character is at a funeral for a family member. The expectations we tend to have of funerals is that people are at least a little bit sad at them. It's a somber affair. However, at this funeral, the large family of the deceased witnesses a surprise procession of dozens of entirely naked people that are carrying the dead body to the song of Closer by 9 Inch Nails. And if you're not familiar with that song, let's just say it's a very carnal song. In the manuscript, it's made clear that this isn't expected tradition. Again, all the funeral goers, from the young adults to the elders, had the same funeral expectations that you and I would have. However, the point of view character is having an absolutely great time witnessing this, and is contemplating the after party and wondering if the naked people will stay. Now, if this were a characterization moment, where we're supposed to realize just how odd the point of view character is, or how he doesn't feel grief, or how he's deflecting grief, it could work. However, of the dozens and dozens of surviving family members who did not see this exhibition coming, only one is said to have left in a huff. The rest sing along and laugh and chatter. The reader is thereby being told that this is perfectly fine and people are happy and having a great time. But here's the thing, this goes completely counter to how the vast majority of readers would predict people to behave at a funeral. This whole scene counters our understanding of human nature. When you have one character act completely counter to the reader's predictions, the reader understands that character a little more. When you have all of humanity in your novel act counter to the reader's predictions, the reader thinks you don't understand humans and closes the book. So how can you avoid this pitfall? Make sure your reader knows that you as the writer are aware when a group's behavior in your story is odd and counter to the majority of readers' expectations. The author here clearly tried to signal to us that she was aware of this by having that one person walk away indignantly. However, that was an unnamed character that never comes back again, and we get no one's reaction to them, so it unfortunately wasn't effective. There are a few options, though, that could guide the reader through such a huge upending of expectations. One would be to switch the point of view to an attendee who is deeply uncomfortable and would reflect the reader's surprise at the spectacle. This is what's often done in portal fantasies, where the main character is a person from our world, so their reactions to all the new customs and rules represent our own and keep us grounded despite the very unusual story world. Another option would be to have the characters all know what is coming, so that way the reader is surprised, and then this upending of expectations serves to just illustrate the character of the deceased rather than make us question what's going on with the whole family. And one more option could be this. Though the setting in this manuscript is contemporary, the genre is an urban fantasy with a lot of fae characters. The point of view character is fae, so we could still keep the chapter from his point of view, but have him witness how the majority of the surprised human attendees are confused and leaving or angry at the spectacle, while all the fae are delighted. This would again serve to help the reader learn something about the fae nature without upending our understanding of human nature. The second pitfall to avoid is teasing future events without stakes or goals. This too is by no means unique to the manuscript that I'm referencing, but I do see it quite often. Early on in the story, in chapter 2, we learn that after the funeral there will be an important magical ceremony. This ceremony is mentioned and alluded to multiple times. I find when writers do this, it's to give readers something to wonder about and ask what will happen at that future event. However, as established previously, if the reader doesn't understand the stakes and goals and thereby doesn't have enough information to make a prediction about the event, they will not be asking what will happen at that future event. And ironically, every time that the event is mentioned, rather than piquing our interest, it will diminish it because we're reminded again that we still don't have information about it. The solution here is quite simple. Do share the stakes with your audience early on. In this manuscript, we learn in chapter 11 that if the magical ceremony does not work, then every fae in the world will eventually die. These are fantastic stakes, but almost as soon as we learn them, the ceremony is successfully performed. Rewriting this so that the stakes are incrementally clear from the beginning will add richness and tension throughout the whole first section of the story. In general, don't ever be afraid of letting readers understand what's at stake and what goals your characters have. And the final pitfall that I'd like to highlight is number 3. If nothing is counter to readers' expectations, skip or summarize it. Now, this curiosity mechanism is not the only way to engage readers. In my podcast, I have a whole series of reader engagement techniques across 6 episodes, each one covering a different technique. However, understanding how to generate reader curiosity is a very important and much used tool in writing. And as we have seen, it spans the whole scope of a story, from the sentence to the entire global structure. So this is why if you're getting reader feedback that a page or a scene or a chapter drags, my first suggestion is to ask yourself whether that section offers the reader either an information gap payoff that is unusual and interesting, or if it sets up an information gap itself. If the answer is no to both of them, then in almost all instances you can summarize or skip it altogether. Going back to Samantha and the bunnies, If I have a paragraph describing her running to the corner store to grab sugar for her cake, even if the store is about to close, but she nevertheless succeeds at getting the sugar and nothing out of the ordinary happens, nothing upends our predictions and nothing makes us wonder about the future, cut it. Don't have her run out of sugar. Or if you need her to be spotted running down the street at that time because later on you will have an instance of mistaken identity where she'll be accused of vandalizing her neighbor's car, let's say, well, just have a sentence or two summarizing her running to the store to get the sugar. The reader won't think much of a sentence or two of extra exposition, and then, when the neighbor shows up at her door accusing her of vandalism, the reader will be asking what happened, and will be delighted that the clue was there all along. But that's a topic for another video. If you found this one helpful, please consider giving me a like and subscribe if you would like more breakdowns of advanced writing craft techniques. And just out of curiosity, what did you think was in the bush? My name is Tina. I'm a writer, writing coach, and recovering academic. Until next time, write on.